Bald is beautiful. All right. I have a couple guesses as to maybe some areas that need to just kind of go over.
Are we taking normal notes or are we talking about the stuff?
We're not going to talk about that yet. So I just want to do like kind of general overview stuff. We might then kind of shift over into that. If we do, I have it on like another page, so it'll be clear that it'll say number 1 prologue, number 2 graduation speech, all that kind of stuff. I have some guesses as to things that some folks might be a little bit shaky on, but open it up to you first. What would be things within the second half where I don't get why that scene happened, or did I read this the right way, or I wrote about this. I use it as an example, but I don't know if I did it quite right. So any like kind of general starting points before I throw out a couple stuff.
I don't exactly understand his interaction with Rollins.
Like the final interaction, or just like in even Roz in general? Not Ras. Roz.
I was saying Raz too.
So we got Roz the Exhorter, and then of course he becomes also Roz the Destroyer. What does it mean to exhort? You're the exhorter. And get people like to do something. You try to get action. So he is kind of like an instigator, but then that ultimately ends up kind of being more of a destroyer. I don't know in history class over the years if Marcus Garvey has ever come up. This would be like 1920s. Marcus Garvey, historical figure. Marcus Garvey was actually mentioned in the eviction scene. When on the study guide that we did before, when all the couple's belongings are going out on the street, one of the things there is a newspaper clipping of Marcus Garvey being deported. Marcus Garvey's from Jamaica. Marcus Garvey comes to the United States, and he's kind of considered more of like a black nationalist, where much more aggressive, much more assertive. His argument ends up being historically, if the U.S. isn't going to treat African Americans equally, then we just need to leave and go someplace else. So he's kind of looking for like a new nation to take place over on the west coast of Africa, is where he's kind of arguing for not deportation, but for people to go. So he's much more of an aggressive, a much more assertive figure. He's from Jamaica, and so Roz, mentions the Jamaican, or it gets described with him having the Jamaican accent. So a lot of folks look at him as being a pretty strong allusion to Garvey. One of the sources that I'll give to you for the synthesis essay is going to be a Marcus Garvey speech, which you could kind of make some ties in with Roz. But Roz is certainly going to be a much more aggressive person with Clifton and with Tim. He would argue that he sees what the Brotherhood's trying to do, which is not help them at all, and is trying to get Tim to kind of join sides with him. Question was coming up with if at the end of the book Tim actually wants to bring the Brotherhood down, why don't he and Roz actually kind of get together and do something together? And I think it's just so crazy, so chaotic, so violent at the end that Roz isn't going to listen to any kind of, hey, let's get together. He's going to go out on his own and try to take people down. The fact that Tim throws the spear at him, which would be a pretty neat scene to see, Roz on his horse, or he has a shield and all that kind of stuff. Tim picks up spear, throws it. Where does the spear go? Right through his jaw, so it literally and figuratively shuts him up. And so by him throwing the spear and taking away his voice, it takes away the one attribute that Roz has, and if he doesn't have the voice, then he doesn't have pretty much anything, and that takes him out. I think also part of maybe shutting up Roz, if you go to Marcus Garvey as the idea that we need to leave, I think you have Ellison kind of putting an end to that idea that you can't leave the U.S., you can't run away from your problems, but you kind of have to deal with them, you have to face them head on, you can't simply try to ignore it. So I think there's a little political commentary taking place that his ideas aren't worth listening to in the end. The irony of it, bless you, of course Tim ends up going underground hiding, but at least he's going to stay and maybe try to get something that can come out of this, whereas leaving isn't really going to work quite as much. But Roz, much more assertive, much more kind of like militant, nationalistic character. But I think Garvey would be a pretty good parallel for him in U.S. terms. Anyone know what a Sambo doll is? Because I usually get questions popping up with that.
It's like a puppet.
It is like a puppet.
Like I picture the thing in the back of the Polar Express that talks to the kid.
I would have to watch Polar Express again. I'm going.
No, you have to remember. It's the ghost and it like possesses the doll and it's really creepy and the toy.
Or like sound.
The only thing I remember from the Polar Express would be if you can't hear the bell, you don't believe in Santa. So I always took the bell out and would make Addie shake it, and then she couldn't hear it. I'm like, why can't you hear it?
That's so.
Why are y'all judging me now? I put it back in later. She could hear it then. "15 years from now, 20 years from now, you're going to do the same thing."
No, I'm not.
She's gonna be scarred
I'm not gonna torture her.
She's fine.
for now.
Are you sure? Do they have one of those? I need to come in home.
Elves a lot of times.
The Elf on the Shelf. Holly.
Gonna buy one?
I didn't name it.
One time I was moving my baby siblings
Has eyelashes, therefore it's a girl.
and they attacked me.
So guys don't
And I
have
couldn't even
eyelashes.
say anything about it because they're like, it's gonna die now because of you. And they're like punching me and my mom was just laughing.
See, and you turned out okay. Sambo doll. Sambo, it is a puppet. It's a puppet slash basically a paper doll. This description you've heard before would refer to it basically as a demeaning or derogatory, racist caricature. And the hope would be that you would have the light bulb in your head go off and go, hey, that sounds an awful lot like the bank. Where does the Sambo doll end up going? In his briefcase with the bank, of course. So, it's a paper doll, string attached to it. The head is probably the head is the most like prominent part of the doll itself. Sambo in itself is a derogatory term. There was a children's book of all things published in like the late 1800s, like 1898, 1899. It's called Little Black Sambo Baby, and it's a story. It's like the Jungle Book kind of type of story thing taking place, but it's demeaning caricatures and all that kind of stuff. Ironically, we found it at Children's Hospital in the reading section. Got rid of it. Had a student who was an intern over the summer, and they found the book. And like, yeah, we probably should get rid of that one. But it's a demeaning racist caricature, which makes it a little ironic. But who is selling these things?
Clifton.
You have Clifton. So you wouldn't expect Clifton to be the one who's going to be selling. There we go. Racist dolls, of African Americans who are going to be dancing around. Why does it make sense, though, within the context of the story, for Clifton to be a guy who's going to be selling this stuff?
Who's the one that gave him those
Tarp. Yep. And the shackle, which also he kind of holds on to, I would say would kind of play in with the briefcase, play in with the bank. Actually, on the paper that you picked up, I think I have Bledsoe's shackle written down as one of the items. And Tarp's shackle would be something that we can kind of parallel back with that. But I would say the shackle kind of ties in with why it's appropriate for Clifton to have this doll, that's a puppet that's basically dancing around. Demeaning caricature, controlled by a string. Why would it pertain to Clifton and Tim even? Okay, so if you take the idea of key term being puppet, you could certainly argue that Clifton, Tim end up being puppets for the Brotherhood. There is a racist stereotype, a caricature of them that is taking place. Clifton finally realizes this and is almost maybe kind of mocking the Brotherhood for it. Could be part of it.
Would Tark also be in it? Because didn't he also just randomly?
He disappears. We don't know exactly what kind of happens to him. You have Clifton's death. You have Tim kind of being exiled from the Brotherhood. You have Tarp's disappearance. And Tarp, again, with Ellison, with names, anything is possible. Tarp looks a lot like Trap, where basically he's kind of trapped in. He's shackled to the beliefs of the Brotherhood. Clifton is basically this dancing puppet. Tim, we know, is invisible, doesn't get recognized for who he is. So you have all these black members of the Brotherhood are somehow being controlled by a greater, power, which really you folks within your TWA yesterday were looking at, that desire for power that folks can have. This kind of motif of these symbolic objects show the power that the Brotherhood would have over them. So by Clifton selling the Sambo dolls, it's almost like a recognition that he is this caricature, and at that point Tim kind of starts to become a little bit more of an independent being, has a little bit more forcefulness behind his speeches. You have the funeral speech that's going to be taking place where he's dealing with more personal responsibility. So that really kind of ends up being a turning point for him. But the Sambo doll, the bank, the fact that all those things go into the briefcase certainly would continue to add on to that baggage that he literally and figuratively is kind of collecting with him. If you think bank and Sambo doll, I think then you have two pretty good ideas that are going to be going together with one another. I'd say that scene's kind of a big turning point for Tim. And I also think when he gets mistaken for somebody. That guy. Oops, I always put an H in his name. Or a second H in his name. What would his business card say? Like, what's his occupation? He's a reverend minister. But what else is he? Gambler. They use the term like numbers man with him. Gambler. He's also well, he interacts with a lot of people. More of the seedy kind of lifestyle that he has. He's not only a gambler, a numbers man, he's also a pimp. He has connections with gambling, with organized crime. And who else does he get along with, where they have an understanding? Clifton clearly did not have an understanding since he ends up being shot. But with the police, Reinhardt has a way of kind of, accept bribery and things like that, where him and the police are okay. So he's accepted by the white police officers. He shifts back and forth to all different kind of roles. What's Tim's great problem or curse really throughout most of the book? Since it's called Invisible Man. And it's not that he simply just can't find it, but as people look at him, when you see Tim, what do people see? Really, whatever they kind of want to see, and for Tim that ends up being nothing. So Emma sees a tool that could be used for the Brotherhood that's not black enough. Bledsoe sees a little naive student who we need to kind of shape and mold and teach a lesson to. Norton, on the subway at the end of the book, doesn't see anything because he doesn't recognize him from years before. But people see Tim in different ways. They basically see Tim the way that they want to see him. They're in control of his identity. What is Reinhardt able to do that Tim cannot do? At least at this point, if he needs to be a reverend, he's a reverend. If he needs to be the pimp, he becomes the pimp. Does he change what he's wearing? Does he change his disguise or appearance? Not at all. And the way that, of course, Tim ends up being Reinhardt is through his hat and glasses, which he ends up calling the glasses his Reinhardt's. But what Reinhardt can do is, depending on who he's with, he's able to adapt and change. Which this is a huge shift in dynamic, where you consider that you have a person in Tim who is controlled by other folks. Reinhardt can shake hands with everyone and kiss babies, and however he wants to be perceived by those people, he's able to do. Anyone pick up on Reinhardt's name? Besides his first name.
Jim.
No.
It's a good guess.
Good guy.
Jokes.
Begins with a B.
So many bees.
Bad.
B. P. Reinhardt, Reverend Bliss P. Reinhardt. What is it to be Reinhardt? It is pure bliss, happiness, contentment with it, because you have the ability to shift, to change. What essentially can Reinhardt do to other people? He's able to manipulate them. And so what you have is, in some ways, he is invisible because he's able to kind of be a shifty kind of person. He can kind of change his identity based on who he needs to be. So rather than Tim, who is manipulated by other folks, Reinhardt is able to manipulate and get folks to kind of look at him the way that he needs to. This isn't a skill necessarily that Tim masters right away, but we know that he does become a manipulator. He has 1,369 light bulbs. He's stealing all the electric power. After this encounter with Reinhardt is when he goes to see Hambro, finds out what the Brotherhood is actually going to do, basically get rid of Harlem. This is when he decides that he's going to try to take it down. He's able to kind of start to shift identities a little bit. It's not that Tim ultimately becomes the bad guy, but he at least does see that there's some potential to being invisible, or at least not having a one set identity, that he's able to kind of use it to his benefit. But his interactions with Clifton and the Sambo doll is kind of like the wake-up call as to you need to look at things a little bit differently, you need to see things differently, and then his interaction or his experience as being Reinhardt would be something that lets him know, okay, wait a minute, there's a way that I can kind of use this to his own advantage and try to get something out of not really kind of being recognized. Like from like the very beginning. So we don't know for sure. We don't get a set timeline. When he's kicked out of school, it would be it's his junior year, so he's like about 21 probably at that point. You get the sense that he's still a young guy compared to other people who would be in the Brotherhood. He's probably in his early 20s at this point, like mid-20s, so like 25, 26. The guy who's in the prologue and the epilogue, you get the sense that this is going to be a person who's a lot older, not like 70 years old or anything like that, but he's been able to kind of think about things more. Ellison himself leaves school, Tuskegee, in 1936, and the book would kind of be published in like 1950. So I kind of use those as the base points for it. So maybe 1938, 1940-ish or so at this point when he would still be above ground. And certainly racial tensions are ratcheting up in 1940. But by the time that the epilogue would be coming to a close, I'd say it'd be around 40-ish. You know, he probably had 10 to 15 years to kind of go by. Any other specific places where folks have questions? All right. Darby, let's take a look at this then. What would be one we're looking at this? So we have like Mary's Bank, which, you know, we just talked about the Sambo doll. That one would be, I think, a pretty clear repetition happening with that same depiction. What would be any of these that you look at and go, I have no clue how in the world you would say that event or that idea repeats itself or shows up again? Like a if I were to go, give me a 3-sentence explanation as to how number whatever shows up again in the book, which one are you going to avoid? Bird droppings. What do we mean by bird droppings with the statue?
Oh, it's
Which statue are we talking about? Okay, so we got the college.
And then he gets covered in bird droppings at the end of the book. Or near the end.
All right, so starting with the statue. Statue's at the school. It's at the college. Who's the statue? Abby? Booker T. Washington. You have a picture of the statue of Booker T. Washington, and remember, it's holding up the veil. You can't tell if it's being lifted or lowered or anything like that. So you have a picture of this one. So historically accurate, statue. We get a description of the bird droppings, where basically the statue is being stained with the bird poop. And I think we even made the comment that bird poop is, of course, what color? White. So you even have, if you're adding on that kind of like little whitewash effect that's happening within the school, it's being stained white. When do we get that idea about something being stained white or being stained with too much whiteness kind of throughout the course of the book? And Ellie was mentioning about, where he gets covered in bird poop, and he does, which I think that part kind of skips by some people. But what would be other parts where you still have that staining kind of happening? Paint factory. With our little paint bucket, where we had almost kind of the reverse, the drops of black going into the white paint. Where else do we get whiteness or white staining? Do you remember when he gets covered with the bird poop?
Not exactly. I just remember that it's like kind of near the end.
It's always your class.
Yeah.
Whatever. Tim's running under a bridge. It's within Harlem. It's after he's kind of started to try to get away from the Brotherhood and gain his own identity. When he goes under the bridge, when he comes back, you have these little bird droppings that are kind of taking place on him. Remember, what is it that Jack asks to Tim when he first thinks about joining the Brotherhood? How would you like to be the next Booker T. Washington? Historically, some criticism with Booker T. Washington is his ideas are too white, that he does too many things that are going to appease the white leaders, the white politicians. Some folks think that maybe Booker T. Washington wasn't trusted within his own community because he's of mixed race, where his father was the slave owner and then his mother was one of the slaves on the plantation. Emma makes the comment, don't you think he should be a little blacker? That was an argument that was being made about Booker T. Washington in some circles, so far as he's the right guy to kind of lead the African American voice historically. So with Tim having this staining that's happening with the bird poop, it's something that kind of is going to associate him back to the statue that maybe, let's see here. If he could end up being the next Booker T. Washington, which he doesn't want to be. So there is at least some chance of him being a Booker T. Is he going to try to break free from that? Or is he going to end up following the same thing where there's going to be a little too much white staining, white control happening by other people? It seems, though, that by the end, he's able to at least kind of come out of that trap of turning into Booker T, and he is going to be a little bit more assertive and take a little bit more action. So a criticism of Washington, the college, the white training that would be taking place is you're not doing enough to lift up your own race. And by the end of the book, Tim recognizes this and tries to not become him and get that stain off of him. He's not going to be whitewashed or brainwashed the way that other folks would have allowed for it to happen. But Tim does have a part in Harlem, little scene where the droppings come off of a bridge onto him. That kind of reminds back of that mockingness that would have been happening in the college for him. The bird dropping is one that kind of folks have a little bit of an issue maybe seeing. The other one's probably going to be Mary Rambo. You remember Mary Rambo's the caretaker for him when he first gets out of the Liberty Paint scene after the hospital scene that takes place. It's not so much that what would be another character that would kind of act like Mary Rambo, but knowing that Ellison likes to do a lot of things with puns, when do you hear that kind of sound? Rambo. We got Ambro. We were just talking about Sambo. I think you can make a case for one other. Kimbrough. Remember, Kimbrough is the guy at Liberty Paints. So his caretaker, his mentor, so to speak, within the Brotherhood, the racist doll, Puppet, the guy at the paint factory showing him how to put the drops into the paint. 4 characters or objects that I don't think we would look at as being very similar, but can you see anything that would kind of link those 4 together, or even like 2 of them or 3 of them together? Because he's certainly doing a little bit of like a mnemonic device to kind of get it in our inner ear that, all right, there's something going on. Okay, kind of like bosses / teacher, boss, teacher, authority would be a good term. And both would be like white authority. That's a good start. Anything else? What kind of influence does Mary have? I would say that she's probably a comforting character. Someone who tries, I mean, when Tim comes in contact with her, he's basically beat up, downtrodden. She's someone who kind of takes him in, gives him not necessarily identity, but a place to stay, a place to kind of get back on his feet, comforting figure that's able to take care of him. Sambo, not necessarily going to be a comforting figure at all. You could say that Sambo and Rambo could kind of go together a little bit in the sense that we just compared the puppet as being pretty similar to the bank, which is in Mary Rambo's house when he throws it against the steam pipe. Mother, teacher, boss, puppet, but through that puppet, there's still a lesson that he is learning about the Brotherhood. All of these things have some pretty strong influence that would kind of lead to realization, I think would be a good term for him. There's a kind of training that takes place with him, with all of these people, where they all try to influence him in some way, and from them he's able to kind of learn things. Kind of teaching moments would be happening. I think Hambro would be the most direct one because his job is to mentor, is to teach the Brotherhood ideologies, but he learns more about maybe his Southern identity through Mary Rambo than he can through any other character. It's after his interactions with Mary Rambo that he goes from being the guy who's putting away the pork chops and grits and wants to get the I am what I am kind of idea. It is Hambro who teaches him about brotherhood thoughts, ideology, things like that. It's Kimbrough who teaches him that people look at things differently, and you could argue based on race. When he's mixing and showing how the paint goes to Tim, Kimbrough's talking about how white it is. Or Kimbrough's talking about how white it is. Tim sees like a black hue, a black kind of stain to it. So the idea that two people could perceive things differently comes across from Kimbrough. And Sambo, the doll, you certainly kind of learn the puppeteering that's happening within the Brotherhood. So all of these things kind of lead to a new understanding of him, of the world from Tim. So I think those names, that repetition, all the time when some kind of important lesson ends up being learned. We'll look at this list a little bit more tomorrow after your poetry quiz. So make sure you look over that. Like Kelly,